Today's story. So we're telling stories of the celebrated Chassid, Rabbi Kletzker. Rabbi he was a big businessman, and the gewaltige Chassid, his business was forestry, lumber, timber. Here's a story with him. So once, Rabbi was in the forest. They're logging, and he's standing there with them. He's come to the site, and the workers are waiting for his instructions as to they finished what they had to do. Now they're waiting for further instructions. And he's standing there and he's completely oblivious to his environment. He's standing and thinking Torah, Chassidus. He's delving deeply into a teaching that he learned about Hashem and so on. And so they're respectful, and after a while, like a little nudge. Rabbi Yomin, what do we do now? So he says to him, wait a moment. Okay. And he's back in, what's the word? Reverie. And he's deep in his thoughts. And now a considerable time passes, and a little bit stronger shake. Rabbi Yomin, there's a time for everything. They're Jewish workers. They realized what he was doing. The time to think deeply to Chassidus is when you daven. We're learning about davening now, right? They're not now. So Rabbi Yomin says, really? He says, when I'm in the middle of davening, to think about business, that's okay. That's all right. So why isn't it okay in the middle of business to think about davening? To think about godliness. And him was also the story that I think it's Moishe Kletzker, that he just concluded a big deal, a big complicated deal. He's thinking with government and so on, and contractors. And so the bottom, it's at the end of so you make the whole, it's a whole, right? It's pages and pages of calculations. And the end it says Sachakol, which means total. So he's writing. So what's the totality? What's now the bottom line? And he writes instinctively, Ein Eid Mulvada. There's nothing but the Eibush. Not to say they didn't make the deal. He made the deal. And there's a tremendous Baltzaka goes with that saying, and lived very simply. But in the middle of the business, he asked me, what's the bottom line? The bottom line is that the Eibush is the only reality. And the Emes is these moments, these precious moments where a Yid in the middle of his business. I've told you the story, I say very briefly with my father. So I'll repeat it again. If you probably haven't heard it in a long time. The story is like this. Wasn't married yet, so it was 1979. 1979, my grandfather, that's Issa, after whom my eldest is named, my mother's father, had a serious cancer of the throat. And at that time, they researched the world's best doctor was a Dr. Conley, who worked in the Mount Sinai, I think it was the Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan. He was the world expert on this, the surgeon. And so my parents picked up, my father left his business and picked up and came back for 3 months to New York. They were stationed at that time, the Park House in Borough Park. It was the only Jewish hotel, and in Borough Park, everything was accessible. And my father was there to support my mother and his father-in-law, and my brother Chaim was not yet in the business, but he wasn't yet in the business, but my father had a lot of time in his hands, obviously. So he would go to the garment district in Manhattan. You all know what it is, I don't remember. Certain few streets there, or a street, and just see what's going on, and also to meet some of the suppliers that they bought from. So there's one particular fellow that my father, that they done, it's not major business, they've done some business with. My father made an appointment to see him. My father relates the story, comes to his office, very elegant, beautiful office. So he's a well-to-do fellow. My father's waiting. He comes early. My father's a very punctual man. He's waiting in the waiting room. At exactly the moment he made the appointment, the door opens, and an elderly gentleman, very elegantly dressed, opens the door. My father stands up, and approaches him with an outstretched hand. And this man vows to my father. I think he raised his hand. Excuse me for not shaking your hand first. He first bows. My father responds, "Sir, you are embarrassing me." Why, father's taken aback. The man sees this, of course, and invites my father into his office, a beautiful office. "Let me explain, Mr. New." So he says to him that your salesman, also his name is Binyamin. We call him Benny Altos. He's a cousin of ours and worked long time salesman in my father's business. So he was here. And as you know, he did some business. And he says, in America, when you're doing business, the whole world doesn't exist. And the volume was considerable, and the penny, one way or another, was considerable gain for one or the other. And we're fighting over these quantities. It's a nickel and a dime. And we're in the intense part of the negotiation. And all of a sudden, your salesman, Mr. Altois, he called him, Mr. Altois, says to me, "Excuse me." He was in the middle of almost getting there, and it was, "Excuse me, I must daven mincha." He says he goes to the wall, he puts on his gartel, starts to daven, and I'm watching him, and I was in shock. I was in shock that he would, and he had the upper hand at this point. The negotiation was almost there, he could lose it. Momentum was in his favor. And I started to remember my childhood, watching him. He came from a very traditional, observant home, he says, but I went on to college and I married a woman who was not interested at all, Jewish woman, but in Yiddishkeit, her children had reformed bar mitzvahs. Another detail, he grew up so poor that for his bar mitzvah, his parents dry cleaned his older brother's suit, and that was the suit for the bar mitzvah. He grew up in poverty. He obviously became very successful. He says, but Yiddishkeit. And he said, and he brought it all back to me, watching him. And he concludes and turns to my father, and he says, with tears in his eyes, he says, "Mr. New, if these are the kind of people that you hire as your salesman, then you must be a very special person too. And that's why I bowed to you." I bowed my head. And he added, since that encounter, I think his wife had since died. Not sure. But anyway, since the encounter with your salesman, this has stirred that spark within me, and I've gotten more involved in Yiddishkeit, going to Shul, Shabbos, and so on. So what's the story? The story is that it was Dafke, in the middle of the business. And that's where a Jew, it's mincha, where he says a godly word. That's where it really penetrates. That's where the great light is created. And that's the ultimate intent. All right, friends.